Perfect, thank you. So thanks so much, Barry, and welcome everyone. Welcome to today's event, Climate Change and Your Career. It's really fantastic to see you all and to be part of such an exciting sort of festival of ideas that Earth Action Hub have put on for us today. I'm Sam Wilson from COP26 and beyond, and with my colleague Ross Baxter, we'll be hosting today. And at COP26 and beyond, what we really try to aim to do is to demystify climate change and to try and suggest some sort of practical ways in which people can make a real difference before, at, and after COP26. And what we try and do is take topics like law, engineering, climate science, and education, and really translate them in a way that inspires people to be able to use those in taking action on climate change. And we really welcome your engagement today. And if you want to tweet us at COP26 and beyond, you're invited to do that. So just quickly, what is today all about? So if you think back, President Biden, when he came in, said, when I think about climate change, the word I think of is jobs. In a recording for this event, Dieter Helm has said that climate change is going to involve everyone in all jobs and all careers. But what we want to find out a bit more is how it will affect everyone. What are these green jobs? Where are they? And what happens to people who are stuck in industries that need to be shut down? What skills might we need in the future to be ready to tackle some of these opportunities? So these are some of the questions that we're thinking about today. And I'm super excited that we've got an amazing panel of experts from across academia, policy, and engineering to help us answer them, and people with a real knowledge of what these changes mean for workers and people in their daily lives. So the session will run in two halves. The first section will try and get to grips with what a green job really is and hear some of the stories of these sectors as they're changing. Then we'll have an opportunity for you to put your questions in the chat for a Q&A on that section. Then we'll have another section that really tries to figure out a bit more about what this words just transition really mean, and think a bit about the sort of future skills that might be required. And we'll have another Q&A after that. So as I say, you're welcome to put your questions in the chat throughout the event. We'll try and catch as many as we can and put them to our speakers in those Q&A sessions. Finally, I just really hope that you leave today knowing a bit more about two key areas: how climate change will affect your careers and your work, and secondly, some really practical ideas about what you can do about it. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ross for the first section. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ross Baxter. Thanks so much for joining our event. We're really excited to have such a great panel put together who can all share their experiences and thoughts on how climate change is affecting jobs and offer ideas on what you can do about it. I just want to spend a few moments now giving our panel an opportunity to introduce themselves. So if I can start with Olga Strzka. Can you please just give us 1 to 2 minutes, a brief introduction to where you've come from and what you might want to be able to offer today. Olga?
Yes, thank you very much, Ross. I come from the International Labour Organization, so greetings from Geneva, which is very, very gloomy and rainy today. I work in the Employment Policy Department in the unit which is called Skills and Employability. That's how we actually see skills development, skills for employment, skills for entering and be successful in your careers on the labor market. And I lead the unit and the work area, which is called Skills Strategies for Future Labor Market. So basically what I deal with are skills for the future. And a big portion of that actually deals with just transition with environmental sustainability. In 2019, we launched the report, which was called Skills for a Greener Future. It was launched actually at the previous COP25. It's a very successful report, also with some focus on which skills, what type of skills, what type of occupations will be required. So I hope to share some of that with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Olga. I can now hand over to Ipek Gençsü. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ipek Gemster, and I'm a research fellow at the London-based think tank ODI. We work around the world on projects ranging from humanitarian aid to economic development, but I'm based in the climate and sustainability program. I got into this field because I was very interested in research around various different topics. I worked on migration before and gender justice and climate change research. And then I went off to campaign for a while with Oxfam, but I thought that I should end up somewhere in between campaigning and doing pure academic research. And that's where I ended up in the think tank field. For those of you who are considering it, it's actually a nice space because you're connected to policymakers, to campaigners, and academia as well. So it's a fast moving research-based organization. And a lot of my work actually focuses on fossil fuel subsidies and government support, public finance and subsidies for fossil fuels, consumption and production. And a lot of the work that we've done recently shows that there's still huge amounts of government support going to these sectors, and we need to rapidly move away from that to transition in a just way to supporting other sectors' cleaner fuels. So I'll talk a little bit about that in part of our exchange, but great to be here with you all today. Thank you.
Thanks, Ipek. And now Ajay Ahluwalia. Hi, Ajay.
Good afternoon, everyone. At least good afternoon from London, which when I was looking through the chat, I could just see that we've got such a wide ranging audience from across the world. So really pleased to be here. I just want to say thank you to sort of the COP26 and Beyond group, as well as the faction for hosting us today. So my name is Ajay Ahluwalia. I'm by trade an electrical engineer. I'm a technical lead on the world's largest offshore wind farm called Dogger Bank Offshore Wind Farm. I work for a company called Equinor, which is a Norwegian energy company, and I've worked in offshore wind for the last 10 years. Worked in the greater energy industry for sort of 12 to 13 years now. I've sort of gone through a bit of a transition myself from having worked in the oil and gas industry as well as the defense industry earlier on in my career, but I've wanted to be get into renewables for a very long time, and I have sort of an interesting story of how I transitioned from that into renewables, which I've been working in for the last number of years. So my day job is very much working on things that you can see in my background here, which is large offshore wind farms. But I also like to get involved with the sort of community angle side of things. I work on a local community project in South London, looking at solar as well. So I believe in order to address the issues of climate change, we need big offshore wind farms, and we also need local community energy as well. So I'm happy to talk about those things in my own sort of transition, my own sort of career with regards to those points today. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ajay. Next, we've got Nick Kendrick joining us from Canada. Hi, Nick.
Hey, guys. As you said, my name's Nick. I'm based out of Calgary, Alberta. If anybody doesn't know what Alberta, anything about it, we got like Rocky Mountains, prairies, and then oil and gas, and the center of oil and gas for Canada. I used to work in the control room, think Homer Simpson, for example, kind of thing, in an oil sands mine. So I had a good career there, but I decided to transition my career to renewables. Oil and gas has been up and down for a long time, so I just felt like I was looking for some stability and try to build for the future. So that's kind of the reason I joined with an organization called Iron and Earth. They're an NGO that was started by oil sands workers looking to transition and support other workers transitioning their career to renewables. So I saw the alignment there. It's exactly what I did. Now I'm a technical analyst for a clean tech project management company. So it just really spoke to me. So yeah, if anybody has any questions about Iron and Earth, I'd be happy to answer.
Thanks, Nick. And finally, we've got Jacqueline Koch. Jacqueline?
I'm a professor of sociology at the University, Wits University in South Africa, and my research is on mining affected communities, and I work a lot with both the labor and the environmental justice movements. And my intention is to try and bring them together, because this, I think, is the best kind of coalition to drive a just transition. But it's very challenging because environmentalists often focus simply on energy issues, even in a privatized form, which is opposed very strongly by the labor movement, which is more concerned with job losses as coal mines are closed. So it's an important but challenging moment.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. So that's all of our panel introduced. And as Sam said in the introduction, the first section of this event is going to be about what green jobs are, and also to hear some stories from our panel about sectors that are changing really fast as we're moving towards a low carbon future. So to start us off, very beginning, what are green jobs? If I can begin by asking that to Olga. We hear a lot of talk about this term green jobs. Like, what does the phrase green job mean to you, and what changes do you expect to see in terms of jobs in the next 10 years?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ross. First of all, what green jobs are. You know, in the ILO, we have worked actually on the definition since 2008, when the first report on green jobs came out. And there have been several revisions, because it's one thing to define green jobs and then also another thing to measure. And of course, when you start measuring anything statistically, it has to be very precise. In fact, you know, if we maybe distance ourselves a little bit from the whole measurement perspective, what is important for us is to have more policy perspective. That's why in the ILO, we apply a very broad definition of green jobs. So basically, green jobs are any job that contributes to preserving or restoring the environment. And if you think about that, it's actually very broad, because it can be applicable to one of traditional sectors, such as manufacturing or construction or agriculture, but it could be one of new emerging sectors that are green per se, such as renewable energy or energy efficiency. And we usually think in terms of, you know, the whole number of different activities, such as improving energy and raw materials efficiency, or limiting greenhouse gas emissions, or minimizing waste, minimizing pollution, protecting and restoring ecosystems, as well as the whole range of activities that support adaptation to climate change, including, you know, in agriculture, where it's particularly very, very important. Also, there is another perspective. You can think about green jobs as all those jobs that are actually producing some green products or providing some green service. So it could be, for example, green building or providing services of clean transportation. But it could be also a green job that simply implements some green processes without having a green product or a green service, such as, for example, some water consumption reduction, or, you know, saving of energy consumption, or recycling and waste management. So these are also greener jobs. And this is purposefully so broad definition, because we would like to see any job, also brown job, greener. You know, there is a potential to green any job. Of course, there are shades of green, but, you know, this is the important message we're trying to bring. Any job can become greener. But of course, this doesn't happen by default. This can only happen if there are important measures implemented. And you asked about the next 10 years. The projection which we produced and published in 2019 is by 2030. And there we look only at two scenarios. One, transition to renewable energy scenario, and another scenario, transition to circular economy. Only these two. There could be more. So cumulatively, in these two scenarios, we know that there might be actually more than 100 million jobs created, which is huge. It's very good news. But also there may be a lot of jobs lost, up to 80 million, which still leaves us in the net positive employment creation. So there will be more jobs created than disappearing, but we know that there will be tremendous amount of jobs altered. That means that people will not be working the same way. That means they will require new skills. And also my argument always is these 80 million jobs do not have to disappear. We don't have to lose them. if we manage to retrain people to newly created jobs, there will be enough jobs for everybody. It's just a question of 80 million jobs, which basically becomes a question of retraining, reskilling, upskilling throughout life. It's not only initial vocational education training and not only higher education, but also reskilling, upskilling of workers throughout their life. And we can think about it as which skills specifically maybe later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Olga. If I can now ask a question to Ipek, just about the big picture here. So can you provide us with your view of what the big picture is of the many different ways the transition towards a low carbon future is going to impact skills and sectors, education? And I know in your work, you've looked at the impact on migration as well.
Thanks, Ross. I think the main policy sort of starting point here is the pace of change, which is really unprecedented. For years, climate science has been clear and scientists have agreed, but it's taken a very long time for politicians, the general public, stakeholders, businesses, insurers, investors to all come on the same page. And over the past 2 to 3 years, well, starting with the Paris Climate Agreement, which was signed in which was agreed in 2015 and ratified later on by almost all countries, there has been an increased pace of change. But really in the past 2 to 3 years, we have seen an unprecedented reality of this, where finance is shifting. You know, governments and banks, both private and government banks, public banks, are starting to say, okay, let's now make our investments in clean energy. Let's start moving away from high carbon, fossil fuel, inefficient, kind of unsustainable infrastructure, energy, transport, etc. And this is happening so quickly that it's unprecedented. You know, in industrial revolutions have happened in different geographies across the world, but they've happened in their own time. This is a global movement, and countries at all stages of development, so high-income countries which are very industrialized, lower income countries which are just beginning to build their energy and infrastructure, transport systems, they're all having to answer these questions about how do we build them in a way that's climate compatible, climate resilient. Of course, the nature of the change is slightly different. So countries that are much more developed are having to readjust their infrastructure. They're having to retrofit, you know, some of the jobs that Olga was mentioning around energy efficiency, insulation, how do we reduce our resource dependency? They're, you know, redoing things. Other countries are building things from scratch, so they're having to provide energy access, for example, for the first time. But they will be doing it in countries in Africa, for example, and parts of Asia. They will be doing it in a way that doesn't necessarily go through the traditional model where you have a centralized power plant, for example, and a grid that connects to the rest of the region, the country. They will be installing a much more energy that can be produced across different parts of the country and different areas. So solar energy, wind energy, etc. So the models are changing, and as I said, it's really about the pace of change. So while there will be jobs, as Olga was mentioning, that are created in these new and clean sectors, there's also going to be a lot of thinking and doing involved in managing the pace of change. And I think this will lead us later to the questions around just transition, but about retraining, about skills sharing. This is where migration comes in. Some of the work we're looking at now at ODI is looking at the collaboration that can be made between the labor sector, migration specialists, and climate and energy specialists, for example, because we all have to coordinate a lot better to make sure we are preparing for those jobs, and the skills exchanges that can be made between countries so that we can meet the pace of change that's required. The International Energy Agency report that was released this week shows that renewables have to take over fossil fuels by 2030 if we are to meet our climate targets, to aim for 1.5 degrees maximum global warming. And that means all hands have to be on deck, and we have to really manage a fast transition. So I think there'll be a lot of jobs involved in managing that transition, as well as creating the new technologies to meet what's required.
Thanks, Ipek. That's Really interesting. Looking forward to hearing more about that a little bit later. Speaking of the energy sector, I want to now direct next question towards Ajay and Nick. Both of you previously worked in oil and gas, and Ajay, you're now in world's largest offshore wind market, working for the largest offshore wind farm. Can you give us your experience on the impact that this transition towards renewables is having on the workforce in the UK energy sector and in terms of jobs and skills?
Yeah, sure, Ross. I think just to sort of flow on from what Ipek was saying before, specifically in the UK, what you have is a traditional energy system that was based on fossil fuel sources, right? So combined cycle gas turbines, oil-based gas turbines, as well as other things such as nuclear. Now we've got this whole sort of thing where we're now trying to replace some of the energy from renewable sources, so offshore wind, onshore wind, solar as well, and that's all coming to the fore. I think one of the key things, just thinking about this transition that we're all talking about, is how do you, in a just or a fair way, how do we take all those skilled and knowledgeable people out of those historic industries and transfer them into this green economy, as it were, whilst at the same time acknowledging that we've got such a sort of committed and young population who want to get into this industry. I think one of the things I'm so fascinated by, and I'm sure there's lots of people on this call today, is that people don't want to just do a job to get paid. They want to do a job that actually has a meaningful, makes a difference, has a purpose. And I think that's one of the great things with renewable energy and the green industries, is how actually there's a huge cause across the world that's uniting us all, in the sense that we all want to do something to help combat this existential crisis, right? So I think when it comes to this just transition, I studied renewables at university, so I was constantly trying to get into renewables, but I just had to work in some other parts of the energy industry before I was enabled to actually get into renewables in 2010. But I think some of my experiences are as a young engineer, and this may apply to other sort of fields such as law or sort of business development and other things like that, is that you've got to be prepared to maybe move around, take side steps, and develop your portfolio of work, pick up different skills. I think I described before how I'd even worked in the sort of defense industry, working on fighter jets and things a long time ago. But the point was that you can pick up skills in lots of different areas, whether it be engineering, whether it be systems thinking, whether it be the sort of integration engineering, all those different aspects there, and then sort of use those transferable skills to get into the sort of area that you'd like to. I think networking is a great thing. So I think another positive step is people who are on this webinar are obviously doing what they can do to learn more about the different fields and the different industries associated with sort of climate change. So in my case, renewable energy, and there's so much content that's out there increasingly to sort of pick up on people's stories and how they got into the industry. So one of the other things I want to stress is that with regards to that, there's obviously the academic route where people go to college, university, study a relevant degree, but there are so many increasingly, at least in the UK, apprenticeships associated with renewables and renewable energy as well. But we've got some huge targets in the UK in terms of how much, for example, offshore wind that we're looking to introduce, 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, and we currently have about 10.5 gigawatts. So a massive amount of offshore wind. And then the key questions around the industry are, well, where are those jobs going to come from? Are they going to come from supply chain jobs? Are the factories going to come back to the UK? Are we going to see lots of operations and maintenance jobs offshore with people working literally offshore on ships for servicing turbines, etc.? Are there going to be lots of data analysts out there who are processing the information and trying to make these offshore wind farms work in a more effective way? So there's so many different aspects to using offshore wind as an example of how people can get involved and how we can start to make sure that this green infrastructure we need, not just from a generator perspective, but the infrastructure like transmission systems as well, can be put in place to facilitate this decarbonisation of our energy industry, which is sort of the area that I'm quite focused in. So I hope that's enough, but hopefully we can go into more details in a bit as well.
Brilliant, thanks Ajay. And now, Nick, so while the transition away from oil and gas is, of course, necessary to mitigate climate change, can you tell us about what your experience has been at Iron and Ore in Canada, of how this transition can also present a threat to many people's livelihoods, and because it threatens their jobs?
Yeah, certainly. So a little bit about myself too, just to give it all context. Like I said, I used to work in the oil sands mine for about 5 years. You make a great living. You get full benefits. It's a good life, right? However, I decided personally I needed to make a change just for building for the future and just self-satisfaction of what I was doing. So I took a master's degree in sustainable energy development. I see one of my former classmates in the chat too, actually. That's kind of cool. So anyways, my capstone project for the program, I teamed up with Iron and Earth at the time, and they were, like I said, they're an NGO looking to support workers transition their career and make a just transition. So what I was hoping to do is help them map out the province of Alberta. They had retraining programs, upskilling programs that they wanted to deliver and have the most impact. So what I did is I looked into where's all the new renewable energy jobs going to be, where's all the fossil fuel jobs disappearing, rural areas where there's less upskilling opportunities in general, so just staying away from city centers, and then also supporting Indigenous workers build careers. So I looked at those 4 metrics, and I was trying to make a heat map, essentially. Where does Iron and Earth need to go to get the biggest impact in Alberta? And it was almost flat. There was no one hotspot that satisfied all 4 of those components. And it just illustrates that it's difficult, right? There's no magic button we can push and say, this is what we're going to do. In a little more context, a lot of people in Alberta resist energy transition. They've all made really good livings. Their kids good educations. They're all in sports. You have a nice comfy home. And the reason is it's hard to go to another industry because there's not a lot of options in these places. And most of the oil and gas activity are in rural, really remote places. I just think it's important to have a respectful dialogue and understand that it's scary to expect somebody to make a really good living. They've been there for the last 50 years, raising their family. They've got kids. To expect them just to stop working in oil and gas, like they're not going to move to Vancouver or Toronto and start working in a high rise, right? These are a lot of people without even a high school degrees making big salaries. They're not bad people. They want to protect their family, right? So I think I've always been a big proponent of just having respectful dialogue, depolarizing. I think we got to remember that I know that it's a huge rush to mitigate climate change, but we also need to do it in a just way. So that's just something I like to just bring up every time. I'm not defending either side or anything. I just think we need to always make sure we're including everybody, no matter their stance. I made a transition myself. However, I'll fully admit I was young. I had a wife that worked. It allowed me to go back to school, but that's not an option for everybody, right? So just to continue having constructive conversations with everybody and slowly building the momentum and education as we can. And that's why I like to speak at these events, is because I can serve as an example that it is possible. And I'm very happy doing what I'm doing now. It was uncomfortable at times, but very rewarding. So.
Thanks, Nick. Couldn't agree more that the transition needs to be just, and you can't just forget about people. And that brings us on to Jacqueline. I'd like to ask you a question. I see your hand is up as well, but I'll ask my question first and then give you the floor. So, yeah, on managing the transition. So in South Africa, coal provides 90% of the country's energy and also about 80,000 direct jobs. And perhaps similar to what Nick is describing in Canada, on one hand, there's that urgent need to stop burning fossil fuels, but then on the other, many people rely on these mines for jobs. So from your research on South African coal mines, can you give us your view on how these communities are being affected?
Thank you very much, Ros. Could I first make the point that trying to bring the labor and environmental justice movements together, we are skeptical about green jobs, because I think that one has to pay equal attention to working conditions. And the first renewable energy factory in South Africa had what I would call black jobs. They were green in a very superficial sense, but in fact they paid low wages and long hours and disrespectful treatment. So I think one has to add the question of decent work to the demand for green jobs. That's my one worry. My second worry is that green can be used in quite a vacuous sort of way. So we, in the alliance we established, which we called the Climate Jobs Campaign, we defined climate jobs. We preferred the definition of climate jobs as jobs which directly challenge the system and which are actually reducing carbon emissions, because otherwise it can be very, very loose. And we found evidence that we could create some 3 million new jobs in renewable energy and agriculture and transport provides 16% of South Africa's carbon emissions. But at the moment, there's a great deal of, well, my third worry about green jobs is that they can easily be incorporated into green capitalism. And as many of us feel that the driver of the climate crisis is the expanding logic of neoliberal capitalism, it is the problem rather than the solution. So it's failing to take account of the fact that this is a very political issue. The just transition is a highly contested and highly politicized notion. But so there are deep divisions in South Africa about it, Ross, and a great deal of anxiety, particularly in mining affected communities, because they are largely excluded from current debates, which tend to be dominated by elites and especially mining corporations trying to defend coal. And the people who are threatened by the closure of mines, and 5 closed mines are going to be closed, their closure is imminent, are very, very anxious. And it's not just the workers, it's also their dependents rely on coal workers to provide a market for informal sector activities. So there's massive anxiety in those communities, mining affected communities, and their voices are largely not heard, which is one of the things we're trying to do through our research, to publish those voices, and as part of linking the struggles for justice and the tendency to appropriate, for powerful interests to appropriate the notion of a just transition and reduce it to something much narrower, simply meaning a new energy regime instead of a total transformation and reducing poverty and inequality.
Thanks very much, Jacqueline. I've got a few questions just before we go into the Q&A session, but I thought I might just give the other panelists an opportunity to respond. Do any of you have any, after listening to each other, do you have any points that you want to respond to from what you've heard about the other speakers? Yes, Olga, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Ross. I just wanted to react to what Jacqueline has said, because in fact, when I said we have this broad definition of green jobs, one thing which I forgot to mention is that in the ILO, we only actually accept green jobs as long as they're decent. So decency of jobs, which means working conditions, whether now these jobs are productive, whether there is a decent income, whether the people are covered by social protection, whether there is a right to organize for collective bargaining. This all is part of the definition. That's how we see green jobs. So I think that at least this worry perhaps now isn't that acute. However, I also concur with Jacqueline on the point that in this transition, of course, the negative consequences, they happen immediately. Very often we receive requests in the country that actually had a very good intention to implement the Green Jobs program, for example, or the move towards the green economy, depending on how they formulate their policy. For instance, in the Philippines, or in China also when they are closing down mines, and if it happens immediately, very quickly, there is no way to retrain people and provide enough jobs for them to transit to new job opportunities. That's why sometimes it's necessary to pace it, to make sure that the whole transition is a little bit slower. And the way to do that, and this is part of the just transition framework also elaborated in the ILO with the help of our constituents. I don't know, but you're familiar with the structure of the ILO, but we're actually the only UN agency that is represented not only by governments, 187 governments, but also by employers and workers. We have employers associations and trade unions equally sitting on our board. So they jointly adapted the just transition framework because they recognize there is a huge opportunity there, but this transition has to be managed. If it's not managed, for example, if you need to slow down, you have to slow down. If you need to pace it with attracting investments towards renewable energy or energy efficiency or other types of pro-green types of businesses so that people actually have an alternative for new jobs, and also provide training, retraining, reskilling, upskilling opportunities. It takes time and it takes resources. So I think this is the very important point when we say, you will need a massive investments into lifelong learning in order to achieve just transition, to make sure that transition is just, that people actually don't lose jobs and they get jobs, they are engaged in jobs, they get the job opportunities. This requires massive investment. We cannot expect that this massive investment into retraining will be done just by governments. This will require private sector chipping in, perhaps individuals also participating financially. This will require some incentives, some innovative solutions that would allow people to get access to these retraining opportunities. So for instance, in this projection, which I mentioned, we found out that people who will benefit the most from job creation, these are middle-skilled men. But people who will lose most of jobs are middle-skilled men. Because there is the largest turnover potentially from that may result from the investment towards green businesses, green policies, green regulations in occupations which are mostly occupied by middle-skilled men, which says if we don't really manage that process, this may be a really very bad consequence for everybody. What we need to retrain these people, but we also need to get more women into renewable energy and energy efficiency jobs and other pro-technology jobs also in recycling and in waste management and so on, also for women. We actually have some very good examples in dialogue.
Olga, sorry, would you mind if we just go in Ipek at that point? Sorry to interrupt you, but just to build on that point, would that be all right?
Yeah, sure. So you wanted to add the question?
I think Ipek was going to build on that point. Sorry.
She's just there, Olga. So I just wanted to bring Ipek in to see how she'd respond.
I was just going to mention something based on what you were saying, Olga. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I actually agree with a lot of what you've been saying, including the pace of change being very important. However, I think we have to watch out for two things. One, about what the science points to. Like, we are already dragging our feet, as it is human nature, and it is the nature of these kind of huge transformations where it takes a lot of effort for everyone to be aligned, and we still have a long way to go. So I think we have to be creative about managing the transition. As you say, people can't completely lose everything overnight. And as Nick was saying, that dialogue is incredibly important. But if that means we have to just shut a coal factory and provide income for those people for a period until they're able to get retrained and into a new sector, then that's what we must do, especially with very high carbon sectors and assets. I think we really have to be realistic about the pace of change. The second thing we need to watch out for is vested interests and businesses who have benefited and continue to benefit and to continue to make profits in these sectors, because I think they will always use it as an excuse that we cannot do this overnight and we have this duty to our shareholders and our workers, etc. A lot of them have been, for example, saying that gas is a bridge fuel, whereas science shows that it's not. I mean, yes, gas is necessary to provide access to a lot of people who don't have it, and there are circumstances in which, you know, a short period of gas use until we're able to build up the renewable capacity and provision of energy is important. But again, we don't want these reasons to be excuses for companies that don't really have a place in a clean energy sector. And it's really about them dealing with the end of their businesses, whether they're able to transform or whether they have to become obsolete for other businesses to take their place. So it's just a word of caution as we manage this transition, to be very strict about, you know, where are we protecting workers' rights, and where are we instead protecting, you know, business owners and their bank accounts. And I think governments and organizations, intergovernmental organizations such as the ILO and many others, have a very important mediating role to play here, holding people to account and making sure that that period of transition is only provided to those that absolutely need it, and that workers' rights, communities' rights are paramount. And anyone else who's using this as an excuse to prolong their business is given strict deadlines, and they're involved in the costs of the transition as well. So just a little addition to your point.
Do you mind if I just jump in and sort of feed in from that as well, if that's okay? So I completely agree with the sentiments of what Ipek was saying. I think one of the things we see with some of these larger, let's just say, legacy companies, is that they have been slow to change. But I'm, you know, quite a positive person. I try, you know, an optimistic person, and see these companies hopefully changing. I think whilst they have a, how could we have what I say here? Whilst we can be critical of them and their slowness and perhaps some of the things that they've done in the past, but we also see some of these organizations as the opportunity with them, because they have a lot of competence, a lot of skill, a lot of knowledge, and the sort of organizations to implement large projects in a quick and effective way. I think, you know, we should see these organizations as, if we can make them do what we need them to do, we can see them as useful organizations to implement what we need to get done in a rapid way. However, what I would just say is that let's acknowledge the point about vested interests, because you know, from a technical perspective, and when I look at how energy is consumed, there's no doubt that looking at things like the better usage of energy and making sure that we use less energy, these are the obvious things, right? If you were to say, here's £1 million, Ajay, what's the first thing you do? I would look at a sort of insulation program for domestic housing, because then, you know, we're actually using less energy, full stop, right? But then, you know, if we can have, you know, sort of local or distributed energy, as you know, Ipek was talking about before, these are all really good and beneficial things. But I just think that depending on your country's or your region's energy system, there is a mixture of different solutions which can come about, whether it be distributed or centralized generation systems. So that's one of the other things I wanted to say. Just to pick up on one point that Jacqueline was talking about, was this opportunity that we have as well. You know, there's a lot of things that are wrong in society. You know, look at the terrible levels of inequality when it comes to diversity, when it comes to women in our industries and how they're not properly represented, whether it be people of colour as well. So one of the things that we're trying to do in the UK, especially with respect to the offshore wind sector, is try to use this opportunity and the fact that there will be this huge growth in jobs, and make sure that there are initiatives in place to make sure that there is greater equality and representation when it comes to things such as gender as well as ethnicity. So I think what we see with this transition is also a great opportunity to sort of take stock of what's wrong with the system and actually try to make sure that as we change, we can actually implement some of these things that are well overdue.
Thanks very much, Ajay. Jacqueline, I can see your hand is up, but I just want to jump into the Q&A session. So maybe I can address, or I can have, I can direct this question at you and see what you think. So we've got a question here there's long been a brain drain from the developing world into, sorry, the developing world into the developed world. How do you ensure that this does not continue to happen with new jobs in, say, renewables, for example?
Maybe I could just tack that one a little bit. Oh, sorry, was that going to Jacqueline?
Yeah, sorry. If I can just see if Jacqueline wants to respond first, that would be great. Oh, Jacqueline, sorry, you're on mute.
I think that's a very good question, Ross, and I wanted to agree with the last two speakers because there's no blueprint for a just transition. It must be built from below by the people most affected, and that is coal workers and people living in coal mining communities. And it's not simply a matter of skills, it's a matter of people's commitments. And people who are leaving South Africa at the moment and taking skills with them are lacking that commitment to ensuring a sustainable future. So I think as important as the emphasis on skills should be the emphasis on democratizing the debate so that the voices from below are heard. And at the moment, Olga, the people who are talking about going slowly and managing the transition are people who represent mining capital. And it's not the workers who are speaking that way, because we also face, I think we have the highest rate of unemployment in the world. So these questions have to be tackled simultaneously. And I think there should be a kind of tax, but I'm just thinking aloud about people leaving and with skills, because they have acquired those skills at societal expense, and therefore I think have a contribution to help us face the crises we face. And they are crises, but they're crises not just of the climate, but also of the inequalities and the hunger and the desperation with which most people live.
Could I just jump in there, Ross? Do you mind?
Yeah, of course.
I'd like to get Ipek's view on that, because I was quite interested in reading your paper on migration that looked at sort of migration in quite a positive light, and there are opportunities there. What would be your reflection on the discussion that we're having?
So thanks for letting me talk about that. So what we're trying to do is to obviously we recognize the current narrative and the importance around climate change impacting people's livelihoods and people being on the move due to climate-related events, etc. But we're also trying to do is build a much more positive narrative around it, because that narrative is being used by politicians for scaremongering, saying, you know, if we don't address climate change, millions will be at our door and they'll be trying to get into our countries, etc. This is not a helpful narrative, and it's using the worst fears and, you know, all the fake news that we've seen around migration, etc. For policy goals that really should be about everyone working together to achieve a climate compatible future. So what we're trying to do is change the narrative a little bit to see migration as a way of addressing climate change, whether that's adaptation, a migration as a form of adaptation, and really recognizing that some places will no longer be habitable, and therefore we have to plan and we have to make sure we provide people with livelihoods and new homes, because the cost of actually adapting their current geographies will be too high, and it's not the best way of coping with the impacts of climate change and their future there. So both adaptation as a migration as a form of adaptation, but also looking at migration in its potential different forms. So it could be skill exchanges, it could be different types of visas, work arrangements. It could be people moving for a short period. You know, there's also great examples from history where in industrial transformations where populations have arrived to help rebuild the infrastructure in a country, for example. So we can draw on those to say that, to show that migration and within countries, within regions, across borders, etc., in different forms can be a way for us to quickly work together towards building the clean and sustainable future that we want. So it's a relatively new discussion, and we actually held a roundtable on this with some colleagues, including from the ILO, as well as the migration and climate community. I think this is a very exciting area. It's a nascent area because, to be honest, I don't know, Olga, if you would agree, maybe to some extent you work with the two communities, but for so long we've worked in silos. So the migration people talking to migration people, understanding each other's challenges, but getting bogged down on that. Labor policy and skills, because it's very technical as well. You know, there's a lot that needs to be done around that. And then climate, energy related, experts working in that field. We all need to talk to each other. We all need to understand that we need flexible structures, policy, because in reality, things are messy and complicated, right? So the jobs that you guys might all be thinking about, you don't even know they exist yet, but there will be really exciting jobs working within those spaces or in between them to try to address these very clear problems that we have in terms of, you know, what are the sectors that we need to change? What are the nature of jobs that we want to create? And what are we trying to build together in line with climate targets? And I think there will be new positions emerging in those sectors, whether it's working from the management side of things or very technical side of things or policy side of things. But it just requires a lot of coordination between the different siloed communities. I don't know, Olga's got her hand up, so I don't know if she's got anything to add or any work that the ILO I know is starting to do in this area as well.
If I can just jump in there. Thanks very much, Ipek. Just so we can keep the time, I was hoping we could just now move to section 2, where we can look more into the just transition part of the event, and I'd love to hear your views on that, Olga. So if I can now hand over to Sam to lead on that part. Sam?
Perfect, thanks, Ross, and thank you, our speakers. We could talk for considerable time about lots of these issues, and we really appreciate your expertise. And I'm sorry to be butting in and cutting you off, but we just want to make sure we can try and cover as much as we can. So really appreciate your flexibility. I think so. In this section, I just really want to talk about two key things: the just transition and sort of future skills. But I just want to kind of bring us back, if we can, a little bit to what this means sort of for actual people and the sort of stories that our audience might be kind of thinking about in their own life, about how they do that themselves and how they make these transitions themselves. So maybe we can just start talking about the just transition a bit. Maybe I could ask a question to you, Nick. So you're involved in oil sands workers retraining. What does this just transition really mean for you? And can you tell us a bit about maybe some of the stories or some of the voices from workers at Iron and Earth who are going through this, and how do they feel about it? Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Great points by everybody. By the way, I really enjoyed following along with everybody's expertise and opinions. And I just wanted to say too that I think it's so important to understand that every region is going to have a different way they can handle it. If you're looking at your neighbor and they're not doing what you're doing, you have to understand that there's probably a reason, right? Even in Canada, each province is completely different depending on different industries. Some provinces have 100% renewable energy right now, quite a few of them, and others are, 70% fossil fuels. And it's impossible to expect them all to get to that 100% renewable overnight, right? So as far as retraining and transitioning, I think it's important to build on what you're good at. That's what I've tried to do while transitioning my career. I look at Alberta, and there's going to be a huge demand for hydrogen, I hope, in the future. I think there's a place for oil and gas companies to transition, or at least be doing that on the side. Just building on those expertise, that's been brought up a few times, right? Geothermal, a lot of drilling companies in the area, maybe that's something they can get into. So just understanding that they can't just completely pivot their career and learn to code. I don't know if you've heard that joke out there, and it's like, it's the most ridiculous thing ever, right? Like, I have a education, I can't do that. So yeah, so just understanding that. So as far as like Iron and Earth, Like our founder, he was sitting around the table of oil sands mine, talking with his buddies, being like, I love this job, but it's, I don't agree with what it's doing to the environment. So he came up with the organization. He was a welder at the time, working on job sites, and they've done a lot of cool projects. There's repurposing abandoned wells. Abandoned wells is a big issue in Alberta right now. They get tapped dry, there's nothing left, and company goes under, bankrupt, disappears, and there's all these abandoned wells in farmers' fields. And so what Iron and Earth has helped do too is those are engineered pads. They needed to be equipped to have big, heavy equipment come in there, drilling rigs. And so they've got a nice road, they've got a power supply. They're transitioning those over to solar arrays in the middle of farmers' fields as a mitigation or a way of moving forward, things like that. So just figuring out those, little synergies, and not what's working here in Alberta is not going to work somewhere else. We're all in different boats. So just understanding that, I think, is vital.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I was going to ask a question to Jacqueline. Okay, maybe I could bring in Ajay. Jacqueline's back. Okay, fantastic. Sorry, I was just going to ask you to follow up on that point, if that's possible, because Nick's been sort of talking about what this means for workers in Canada, and I know that you've done a lot of work with coal mining communities and informal traders in KwaZulu-Natal and across South Africa. Can you tell us, because we've here in London feels a long way away from KwaZulu-Natal. Can you kind of tell us what these communities that you're working with really feel about a just transition? And then tell us a bit about what you think a just transition should look like.
Well, part of the difficulty is the level of unemployment. And I'd say that it's very, very, there's a great deal of tension. The notion is very contested. For many in the labor movement, the just transition is an opportunity for a deep move away from carbon capitalism and to have a redistribution of power and resources, moving us towards a society based on needs rather than profitability. In other words, socialism, but a new kind of socialism that's ethical, that's ecological, that's democratic. But there's also that sort of revolutionary optimism conflicts with anxieties people have about daily needs and concrete issues. And the fact that in many, many cases, those communities have been dispossessed, not only of their land, but their livelihoods and their ancestral graves, which are very important to those communities. And so there's an emphasis on the justice factor, but there's an emphasis that's not coming out from this discussion, but I'm hoping it'll come out from the audience, that we have to, the starting point has to be, this, as the slogan says, system change. And we have to talk about where power lies and how to contest that power. Because at the moment, there's a tension between a hopefulness about a very different future, where everyone lives well and no one lives better than anyone else, and the immediate issue of putting food on the table. But one comment which was very telling for me was at what we call exchange workshops in a rural community in KZN, who said, this just transition is killing us, meaning that, and certainly there's a lot of pessimism about, because there's a lack of planning and discussion, there is no provision for, there's talk about a universal basic income grant, but there are no plans for reskilling or relocation or income support of any kind. So there's this mixture of optimism and anxiety.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. I want to see if it's possible. I'm sorry we don't have loads of time because I want to get onto the discussion of skills, but do any of the other speakers quickly want to have just a kind of short comment on a just transition before we discuss skills?
Just a quick one, Sam.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think, yeah, I mean, Jacqueline's right. I mean, I've been sort of been talking about the UK, where despite the pandemic, there does seem to be a positive outlook in terms of there hopefully being quite a lot of jobs on the horizon, and us having a, you know, half decent government, which is actually, and I said I wasn't going to get political, you know, a governance system in place whereby, you know, the idea of creating jobs is quite important, irrespective of whatever political party you subscribe to. So the idea of that and having governments in place that facilitate that is important. But as Jacqueline's just reminded me, you know, sometimes, you know, there's a lot of, this is an international community of people on the call today, and your respective governance structures might not be facilitating that as well. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's a real tricky one, really, because it's quite easy to say all these green jobs around the corner, but are they where you are? And I guess if they're not, what do you do to try and get a job in that area if you're interested, or B, you know, to try and be part of that positive change in terms of lobbying or sort of, you know, the level of activism to create jobs and see that change within your local area. So yeah, I think just a bit of a sense check here, which is, you know, it might be okay in some places, but it's not okay all across the world. And what do we do with that situation? So I'm not really giving any answers there, but I'm just acknowledging the situation isn't as rosy as it might be for some other countries.
Perfect, thanks, Ajay. I might bring you in next, if that's all right, Olga. And if you could, just a quick comment on a just transition. But what I'd really like to ask you is more about the skills and the area that you're expert in there as well. So if I could ask you as well, sort of what skills do you think are really needed for a greener future, and how we can really help support develop those skills? Thanks so much.
Sure, yeah. Look, just very briefly on just transition, I think it's not accidental that we got back to the discussion about planning and, you know, all the actors that have to be part of that planning, and this actually takes time. So basically my point gets back to the whole pacing issue, because, you know, Ipek, there've been experiences in European countries that did shut down their mining, coal mining, and all these people were given income, but they never got back to the labor market. Basically, you know, they all continue staying on the state support. And this is basically, you know, this is the funds which might not be available simply in developing countries. This is the problem. And that's why the whole just transition framework for us is really not only multi-stakeholder, because they need really to talk to each other, as simple as that, and have some kind of a participatory policy decisions and prioritization, as well as pacing and the provision of retraining opportunities. But it's also policy which is coordinated by itself, because what you're talking about, Ipek, is subsidizing fossil fuel energy generation, and it might be the same country that is also investing in renewable energy, and they only talk about investing in renewable energy, and they don't mention how much they actually invest or subsidize, or what kind of tax breaks they provide for the investors into fossil fuel energy generation. So this kind of coordination has to be there. And also the complexity of these measures. Imagine people who are going through the green transition. It's only one of many transitions. There is also digital transition, and, you know, the media and talks about how many jobs may disappear. There is demographic change as well. Now we have the COVID and the consequences of the COVID, that we're actually losing jobs 4 times more than as a result of the financial crisis in 2008-9. 4 times more. It's absolutely unprecedented. So it's multiple layers of transitions, and then individuals find themselves in these multiple layers. So they have to act somehow. For this, they need the policy of the country, which is wise, which doesn't really provide subsidy to fossil fuels, but attracts investments. Also in developing countries, I saw there was a question how to make sure that people actually don't go. In order not to go, they need to have jobs in the countries where they are, in developing countries. That's why they need to implement all these complex policy measures, macroeconomic, fiscal, but also people have to be covered by social protection, because if this happens and they have to retrain to a new job, they need at least, you know, some income. We don't have a universal basic income, at least for the moment. It's not really in place anywhere. only experimental in few countries of the world. But social protection flows is something what is accepted by the whole world. But it's not that all people are covered. And this is the key. Also active labor market policies, especially for those people like people with disabilities or migrant workers or women, in order to get them into those green jobs, they actually need a very targeted approach. So now in terms of skills, look, because it's maybe the discussion in itself for the whole hour, if I a little bit oversimplify, what makes a person successful in the in any transition, not only green transition, in any transition, is a good combination of technical skills, basic skills, and soft skills. So when we speak about technical skills in relation to the green transition, these are not only higher education kind of skills. These are not only environmental specialists or environmental engineers, even though them as well, but it's also the whole range of occupations that are affected as the result of green regulations and green policies. Plumbers, electricians, sales workers, manufacturing workers, the whole range of them. Now, to transit easier for example, an engineer from the sector, which is in fossil fuel energy generation to a renewable, and I think Ajay may correct me if I'm wrong, what makes him strong as an engineer is his engineering skills. So strong core technical skills, they are transferable. But then also basic skills such as numeracy, literacy, environmental literacy, and digital literacy that allow the person to learn further, to build new skills on this foundation, on this basis. And then soft skills, we call them in dialogue core employability skills, because this is like an employment security that allow a person to move from one job to another, from one sector to another, even from one country to another, also in relation to migrant workers. And these soft skills for the green transition, this is resilient skills, this is system thinking, this is customer advice. It's, for example, when a plumber comes to a household, of course, a plumber needs to have good plumbing skills, systems understanding, and thinking, how I can suggest maybe some new solution for this household in how to save water, or how to save energy, or how to connect to some solar system solutions or ground heat pump or something else. But also to be able to advise the customer. It's communication, it's marketing skills, not only understanding, but also delivering the message, because the plumber becomes an advocate of the green transition for this little household where he is now.
It's perfect. I'm sorry,
combination of these three types of skills.
One minute, if that's all right, Olga. Thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry, that's fantastic. I really appreciate it. I just want to move on, just because I want to get some of these questions through from the audience. So what I might just do to wrap up this before we go to the Q&A, I just want to bring us back to really thinking about our audience here. And what I'm going to ask all of our speakers to do is just in 1 or 2 sentences before we get to this Q&A, if you could direct some advice directly to our audience here. And I want you to see if you can provide an answer to this question for them. So we've painted a picture today of a world that's moving, a world of work that's moving very rapidly and changing very fast. What advice would you give people in this audience who might be looking to transition to green jobs themselves as they navigate this new world? That can be either from your research or from your personal life or from your personal experience. What advice would you give to young people, young or old today? I might go to you first, or if anyone would like to go first, I might go to you, Ajay, if that's all right.
Sure. So just to be clear, what you're trying to get at?
I want to. There's people in our audience about to. Yeah. Okay. Ipek, do you want to go first?
I have an answer, and then maybe Ajay see if it's the right kind of answer. So I would say keep your eye on the prize in terms of the kind of job that you want to do, which gives you a sense of purpose and joy every day, but be open about the way and like the different possibilities of the jobs that can give you that. So I think we might have in our minds like, oh, I would like to work in this industry, I would like to work in this technical job, and I would like to see myself as an engineer working on clean energy, or in marketing for renewables, or whatever your skill set is. You might have an ideal job. Maybe be open-minded at the start, because as Olga was saying, like there are lots of skills that you can bring to use in very different jobs. And I think some of the jobs of the future are really only developing now. So we don't even know what they are. So I think be open to starting anywhere, or if you're transitioning, be your first transition job to be something unfamiliar, and just roll with it. Because I think in every position, you'll be able to build on your skills and learn new things, which you can then adapt and build your CV, and it can lead to something else. So I think about the sense of purpose and the joy. And of course, there are technical things like, the income level and your expertise and what that matches. Obviously, those have to be in place. But aside from that, I think if you just concentrate on, I would like to do something that is going to be beneficial for my community, for the planet, and it's going to be on the right side of history, I think that's a really exciting place to start. And then, maybe a little bit more open to what that particular job might be. And because I feel like at the start of my career, I kind of had my hopes set up on landing particular positions in particular organizations, and they never happened. And I ended up actually by chance falling into certain internships, then starting positions, not entirely what I wanted, but then one thing led to another. And I think building a career or switching to a new sector and rebuilding your career in that way, it can work out. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
Yeah, thank you.
That has got my brain juices flowing, Sam. Can I maybe just add one thing to this, though?
Can you be really short? Because I just want to get to...
Sorry. Just be patient as well. I mean, look, the first job that you have might not be the job that you want. So just be prepared to acknowledge that you might not get everything you want to start with, and be patient and just look for those opportunities. Keep your head down, work hard. Continue to do learn and to develop your knowledge outside of your job as well. And we talked a lot about purpose, and we talked about getting satisfaction from your job. But that is an amazing thing if you can get it, but you don't always get it. And that's why people do volunteering and do other things outside of work, where you can be an activist, or you can be part of a sort of community project that is looking at things like biodiversity or energy or whatever. Just because you're not able to do something in your day job doesn't necessarily mean you can't have a positive impact on the world outside of it as well. And I'll stop there.
Fab, great advice as well. Jacqueline, just a quick 1 or 2 sentences from you on that, if that's okay. Sorry, you're on mute.
These answers are far too individualist, and I would quote to them Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, who recently said, of course, there's a war on. It's a war between the rich and the poor, and my class, the rich class, is winning, he said. So the advice I would give to people, the young people in the audience, would be, whose side are you on? The side of the poor and the powerless, who are being most affected by the impacts of climate change, or on the side of the rich and the powerful, concerned with things like income and prestige and whose interest do you want to serve in your one and only life?
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, cool. So we've got another 10 minutes, if that's all right. And I'm going to try and group a few of the questions that we've been gathering in the chat together. We've got a question about what are the implications to change education here? Someone has particularly mentioned that do we need to kind of increase the amount of STEM learning and science that's involved in education? How do you think education should change as a result of this? And then we had another question about focusing on. No, I'll ask that one first. I've lost the other question. How do you think education should change for now? Would anyone like to answer that? Nick, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I think you've kind of already answered it from my perspective, but I think STEM is so important because those are the jobs. If you've got that educational background, then you're going to be able to pivot easier as things develop. I can already tell you, like right now, I was the only one with a university degree on my team up in the mine, and I was the only one that left and transitioned. It's a lot to ask of people that don't have the right tools. And just having that education from an early point. We struggle here in our home province. I keep talking local, but it's what I know, so sorry. But just getting STEM and even just climate change education in elementary school is a battle. So, which is unbelievable, right? So just keep hammering down on the education. I think it's, and then my first job out of university, but just tagging along to what Aja said about taking these small opportunities. I was working 5 hours a week teaching elementary school students about climate change and energy efficiency. That's how I started with a master's degree. And then now I've keep going to the next challenge, and I've got a place where I'm quite content. So just to put that message out to people too, and volunteer every chance you get. That's where you're going to learn. But yeah, STEM 100%.
Thank you very much, Nick. We've got another question here that says, what's been interesting so far is that we've almost focused entirely on the energy transition and not on something like food supply. So maybe I could integrate that with another question that's about, not just focusing on formal employment, but also informal employment, and particularly as that's a major feature in developing countries. And we've had some questions in the chat about what this means for informal employment in developing countries. So would anyone like to answer those two? Sorry, the first one is about what are the implications not just for the energy sector, but for food supply and for people working perhaps in agriculture and in the involvement of food. And the second question is about, and an extension, what's the implications for informal employment?
I can quickly jump in on the land use. I think, thank you for pointing that out. We have focused on energy and infrastructure and transport so far, but I think it's very important to remember that agriculture and land use change is a huge source of emissions. And it will again take another hour to explore it in detail. But yes, I think the nature of jobs in the agricultural sector are changing to become more resource efficient and to make sure that we produce and consume. So we produce enough food to feed the entire world right now, but there's a huge amount of food waste. And to make sure that production is made in a way that is sustainable and also lower emissions. So when it comes to cattle and meat consumption, for example, that's also something that contributes to emissions to a very high degree. But again, there are huge sectors of workers who've been working in that area where farming and cattle is a huge part of their lives. Again, the transition has to be thought through there as well. So absolutely, it's a huge part of the question. And to be honest, I think there's a reason why we didn't focus on it so much, because I think it's quite specialized. Like even in my field, in think tanks and research institutions, the communities working on those topics, I have some colleagues on agriculture and land use, really have their own groups and their research expertise specialty. It shouldn't be the case, right? Because some of these questions around the pace of the transition and about skills and technical exchanges, etc., apply across the board to different sectors. So I think absolutely a good point to bring that in, and it's something that will go through a huge transformation as well.
Could I add to what Ipek has said, because I think that just transition is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to demonstrate what people already know, but they don't name it, which is that capitalism as a system is unjust and unsustainable. And this is an opportunity to come up with alternatives, real alternatives. And I think restricting our conversation to energy is narrowing the potential transformative, the deep transformative nature of the concept in a way that is not helpful.
Thank you very much. We've got a question here, and I think one of you alluded to this by saying that sort of quite a lot of the jobs that we're talking about haven't yet been invented. We've got a question here about sort of lifelong learning, and that's really, if all these sectors are changing so fast, and maybe the skills that we need tomorrow for jobs that haven't yet been invented yet, what does that mean for how we think about education as a lifelong process? And maybe is it a mistake that we learn everything in the beginning of life and then not after necessarily? And do we need to make changes to, I don't know, universities and the length of degrees or the type of courses that people can learn throughout their life in order to reskill and relearn to adapt to these changes? Would anyone like to?
I'll jump in with one. And I don't.
Yeah, and then Olga after. I think you had your hand raised as well.
I think obviously this massive transition that we're all going to go through is going to be a catalyst for asking these questions again. But maybe I'm going to be slightly controversial here and say I don't think that's, it's not as if people haven't gone through career changes in the past, or there haven't been significant changes that have happened in different countries. For example, look at the coal mining industry, which was decimated in the 80s in the UK for various reasons, but nonetheless, those sorts of things happened. And the question is, the question more is what things can we put in place to help those people retrain? What sort of education systems exist? Colleges, universities are, to come back to this point around good governance, are bursaries or forms of investment being placed to help people retrain. So I think it's quite an expansive subject really, which is how can people retrain? To what extent are people going to do things under their own speed as well? So, as much as we want governments and everything, you've got to take some sort of personal responsibility as well for you to take these decisions and to move in that direction that you want to go to. And some of these decisions aren't easy as well. If I come back to my own sort of engineering world, we're encouraged to do continued professional development, and a large piece of evening lectures or going to different webinars. These are all ways that we can self-learn. But in terms of formal things, I think you've got to have that sort of drive and determination a little bit for yourself as well to go see those things.
Perfect. And did you want to comment on that, Olga?
Yeah, I think you're right, Sam, by saying that it's not the same pattern. We used to really learn and then we went to work, and basically, even if we transferred from one work to another, it used to be within the same occupation. We already see the change now. Young people now move from one job to another within the first transition period of 5-10 years, and very often this is several jobs already. But it's also beyond that. We have to see that there is an opportunity to get elements of your qualification and re-qualify yourself, have different specialization eventually by multiple means. In other words, education as a system doesn't have an exclusive right on providing, on capacitating people anymore. So the education system also has to recognize that. Of course, they have to be labor market oriented. There should be some dialogue between private sector and education and training providers. But also beyond that, we need to recognize that now there are so many possibilities to reskill, upskill through online, informal, non-formal learning. And at the same time, not enough access to funding. This is one of things which we really need. And Ajay, I totally agree with you. This is what we call the lifelong learning ecosystem, which would also speak for governance mechanisms and those mechanisms that allow an individual to get access to training and get access to funding lifelong learning that might be co-financed by government and the private sector and an individual as well, because we can't put the whole burden on individuals in these multiple transitions. That won't work. But what is important from the education point of view is that there should be a system in this ecosystem that recognizes these different elements, bits and pieces of learning, and through some system of micro-credentials, recognition of prior learning, really grants qualifications to people who have gone through this informal, non-formal learning, or even learning by doing in the workplace, so that they can move easier in their multiple transitions during their lifetime between different jobs in the future. And my advice usually actually to young people, because this is something you asked before, is to become composers of their own qualification, which they can earn from multiple means, funded through multiple sources, informal, non-formal, online, offline, blended, compose it yourself, and make sure that this is something what you can manipulate in a kind of soft way. If you need to adjust a little bit, get a little bit requalified, get to a sister job, or if you want to change your occupation completely, don't be scared of that. Just do that, because this will be the reality of the future eventually. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would love to continue this conversation for longer, but I'm afraid we have to bring it to a close for now. So yeah, I'll just hand over to Ross quickly, and then thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I just want to echo that. Thank you so much for dialing in. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. It probably could have gone on for an awful lot longer. I hope you all feel like you know more about how climate change will affect your work and hopefully what you can do about it as well. Huge thank you to all our speakers. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise in this topic. And to all the attendees, if you want to find out more about our speakers, we've got biographies on them up on the website, along with some pieces that they've written. And I also just want to add, we've got these 2 short videos provided by Professor Dieter Helm and Sarah Gavioli that are on our event page. They're really interesting and should provide you a bit more information on this topic. So I'll leave Sam to close out the event.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Ross. Yeah, just echoing that. Thank you so much to our speakers for your time and the generosity of your expertise. It's hugely valuable. And thank you all for attending. I'd just also like to thank the Earth Action Hub and especially Barry McLaughlin. We've talked a lot today about, what young people need to do. And if anyone's a good example of young people who've really got the wind in their sails, it's the guys who are organizing this amazing event. They've got 2,000 people and tons of other events and talks going on over the rest of the 3 days on climate. So I really would encourage you to get stuck into the rest of the program and really enjoy all the things that they've got on offer. We'd love to stay in touch at COP26 and beyond. You can sign up to follow our newsletter on our website, cop26andbeyond.com, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And yeah, if you like these workshops, we're really pleased to say that we're going to be running some similar things on law, on engineering, and on education as part of the All for Climate event in Milan before COP26 itself. Finally, just to say, I think that it's been really, really valuable and interesting for me to hear such a diverse range of opinions today, and to welcome an audience from as far afield as Canada, Sri Lanka, Palestine, Brazil, Turkey, Serbia, Malaysia, India. It's fantastic to bring everyone together and to engage in what Nick was saying in just a really respectful and interesting dialogue. So thank you so much. Have a great evening and enjoy the rest of the festival. And thanks so much for tuning in.
Bye.
All the best, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.